In the UK, roughly one pub closes permanently every single day, and yet people are still queuing up to buy them. That tells you something important about this business. It's not that pubs can't make money, it's that most people go in without understanding a financial structure that's genuinely unlike almost any other hospitality business, built around something called the beer tie that most first-time buyers have never even heard of. Most people think owning a pub is about pulling pints and chatting with regulars, a cozy, low-tech business that basically runs itself once the doors open. It's actually a business with genuinely thin margins, seasonal swings, and a supply chain relationship that can quietly determine whether you're profitable before you've poured a single drink. Understanding exactly how that works separates the landlords running a genuinely healthy business from the ones who bought a beautiful old building and can't figure out why the numbers never add up. So let's actually open the books on this one.
The reality check. From the outside, a pub looks simple. A bar, some taps, a few tables, regulars who show up every Friday, maybe a Sunday roast. It looks like one of the more approachable small businesses out there, especially compared to a restaurant with a full commercial kitchen. What's actually happening behind that bar is a business with real structural quirks most people never think about. In the UK specifically, a huge share of pubs operate under what's called a tied arrangement with a pub company or brewery, where the landlord gets a lower rent in exchange for agreeing to buy beer, wine, and spirits exclusively from that supplier, often at prices meaningfully higher than the open market. A smaller share operate free of tie, paying full market rent but sourcing drinks independently at better wholesale prices. That single distinction changes the entire cost structure of the business before you even considered staffing, utilities, or footfall. Add in licensing requirements, a premises license, and often a designated personal license holder responsible for the sale of alcohol, plus a business that swings hard between a packed Friday night and a dead Tuesday afternoon. And you start to see why pub economics reward operators who understand this structure deeply, not just people who enjoy the atmosphere. But here's what the numbers actually look like.
Chapter 1. Startup Costs. Getting into pub ownership varies enormously depending on whether you're buying the freehold outright, taking on a leasehold, or signing a tenancy agreement with a pubco or brewery. And this decision affects the entry cost more than almost anything else. Buying a freehold pub outright, meaning you own the building and land, commonly runs £300,000 to £800,000 in the UK, depending on location and size, with prime locations in London or popular tourist areas pushing well past $1 million. A leasehold purchase, where you're buying the right to run the business for a fixed term but don't own the property itself, is typically cheaper up front. Often £50,000 to £200,000 for the lease premium and fixtures, but comes with ongoing rent obligations. The lowest cost entry point is usually a tenancy agreement with a pubco, where the entry cost can be as low as £10,000 to £30,000 for initial stock and a security deposit, precisely because you're trading lower upfront capital for a tied supply arrangement, and often less favorable long-term economics. Beyond the property itself, new licensees need a premises license through the local council, which involves an application fee and often a personal license qualification course, plus initial stock for the bar and kitchen, if food is served, commonly £15,000 to £40,000, depending on pub size. Kitchen equipment for a food-serving pub, fixtures like furniture and glassware, and initial refurbishment to bring a tired building up to a standard that attracts customers can easily add another £30,000 to £150,000. Here's what most people miss. The tied versus free of tie decision matters more to long-term profitability than the entry price itself, since a tenancy with a lower upfront cost can end up costing far more over several years through inflated drink prices, which is exactly why experienced operators run the numbers on total cost of supply, not just the headline entry fee before signing anything.
Chapter 2. Revenue Streams. A pub doesn't make its money one simple way. It stacks several revenue lines, and the mix between them determines a huge amount about overall profitability. Wet sales. Beer, wine, spirits, and soft drinks remain the traditional core of the business, and pricing varies by region, but a pint of beer or lager commonly retails for $4.50 to $6.50 across much of the UK, with London and premium venues running higher still. Food sales have become an increasingly important revenue category for what the industry calls gastropubs. Here's a distinction worth understanding clearly. Drinks actually carry a higher gross margin percentage than food, since the markup on a pint or a glass of wine is genuinely steep compared to the ingredient and labor cost behind a plated meal. Food's real value lies elsewhere. A strong menu, particularly Sunday roasts and midweek dinner covers, boosts total spend per customer and drives volume on days when drinking traffic alone wouldn't cover the overhead. Which is exactly why food-focused pubs often outperform drinks-only venues on overall revenue, even with a lower margin percentage on that specific category. Event hosting, private parties, quiz nights, live music, and sports screenings drives incremental footfall on traditionally slower days, filling tables that would otherwise sit empty on a Monday or Tuesday evening. Accommodation is a significant additional revenue stream for pubs with rooms attached, common in rural and tourist areas across the UK, essentially turning the business into a small hospitality operation rather than purely a drinking establishment. Here's the number that surprises most people. Because wet sales carry such a strong markup on cost, even a modest shift in customer mix toward drinks over food on a busy night can meaningfully change a pub's overall profitability for that shift, which is exactly why experienced landlords watch the ratio between wet and food sales as closely as they watch total revenue.
Chapter 3. Operating Costs. Now to what actually eats into that revenue. And running a pub carries costs that hit differently depending on that tied versus free structure covered earlier. Cost of goods, the wholesale cost of beer, wine, spirits, and food ingredients, is the largest variable cost, and this is exactly where the tied arrangement bites hardest, since tied publicans often pay noticeably more per barrel or per bottle than a free-of-tie operator sourcing independently, even though their base rent is lower to compensate staffing. Staffing is typically the largest controllable cost, covering bar staff, kitchen staff if food is served, and often a manager if the owner isn't running shifts personally. And with minimum wage increases across the UK in recent years, staffing costs have climbed as a share of revenue industry-wide. Rent or mortgage payments on the property, business rates charged by local councils, and utilities for a building running long hours with refrigeration, lighting, and often a full kitchen add substantial fixed overhead regardless of how busy any given week actually is. Maintenance on an older building? Many UK pubs occupy century-old properties, along with insurance covering public liability and alcohol service, and marketing to drive footfall on quieter nights round out the picture. Here's the retention hook worth remembering. Because rent, rates, and a base level of staffing stay largely fixed whether a Tuesday afternoon brings in 5 customers or 50, a pub's profitability depends enormously on filling those quieter windows, rather than just relying on a strong Friday and Saturday to carry the whole week.
Chapter 4. Profit Margins and Real Numbers. So what's actually left over? Industry data commonly cited by UK pub trade bodies puts well-run food and drink pubs in the 10% to 15% net profit margin range on total revenue, which is respectable but requires real discipline given how thin the margins on individual drinks can be after cost of goods. Let's run a real example. Take a solidly performing community pub generating £500,000 in annual revenue through a mix of wet sales, food, and occasional events. Cost of goods at 32% of revenue takes $160,000. Staffing at 28% takes $140,000. Rent and business rates at 14% takes $70,000. Utilities, maintenance, insurance, and marketing combined at 12% takes another $60,000. Add those costs together. $160,000 plus $140,000 plus $70,000 plus $60,000 equals $430,000. And that leaves $70,000 in annual net profit, a margin of exactly 14%, right in the middle of that industry range. Here's what separates a pub that's just surviving from one that's genuinely thriving. Growing food and event revenue matters more than simply hoping for busier drink nights, because rent and a meaningful chunk of staffing costs barely move as revenue grows. Push that same pub from $500,000 to $650,000 in annual revenue through stronger food covers and regular events on quiet nights, and while cost of goods scales up proportionally with that extra volume, staffing only needs to grow modestly and rent stays completely fixed,
pushing net profit up to roughly £147,000, a margin of over 22%, more than 60% higher than the original percentage, from a revenue increase of just 30%. Chapter 5: Risks and what makes someone succeed or fail. Now, the honest part. This business has real pressure points, and they're worth naming clearly. The tied supply structure is a genuine ongoing risk for tenants and leaseholders. Being locked into buying drinks at above market prices from a single supplier can quietly erode margins for years. Here's a detail worth knowing if you're already in a tied arrangement. Under UK pub code regulations, tenants of the larger pub-owning companies actually have a legal right to request what's called a market rent-only option, allowing them to move to free-of-tie terms at a market rate rent instead of staying locked into the tied supply arrangement. Though actually negotiating a fair rent adjustment through that process requires real financial leverage and often professional advice. Seasonal and weather-dependent footfall is a real challenge too, since a run of bad weather or a quiet economic stretch can hit a pub's discretionary spending customers harder than a business selling genuine necessities. Rising business rates and utility costs have squeezed margins across the UK pub sector in recent years, and because so much of a pub's cost base is fixed, regardless of how busy any given week is, even a modest and sustained drop in footfall can flip a healthy pub into a loss-making one surprisingly quickly. But here's what actually separates landlords who thrive from ones who close their doors: treating food, events, and off-peak programming as seriously as the core drinks offering. The most successful operators build a genuine food program that drives higher total spend. Fill traditionally quiet nights with quizzes, live music, or sports screenings rather than letting them sit empty. And where possible, use their statutory rights or direct negotiation to move toward free-of-tie terms and escape inflated supply costs over the long run. The landlords who struggle usually made one of two mistakes. They signed a tied tenancy without fully understanding how much it would cost them in inflated drink prices over time. Or they relied entirely on regulars and a strong weekend, leaving quiet weeknights as pure dead weight on the balance sheet. This is a business built for people who think like hospitality operators every single day, not people who just enjoy the idea of running a local. Everything here is general business education, not financial, legal, or investment advice. If you're seriously exploring pub ownership, you'd want a solicitor experienced in licensed premises, an accountant familiar with hospitality finance, and a careful comparison of tied versus free-of-tie terms before signing anything. What's clear from the numbers is that a pub isn't really a simple, low-tech business. It's a hospitality operation with a genuinely unusual supply structure, where the winners are the ones who treat their supply agreement and their food and events program as seriously as they treat the atmosphere behind the bar. So here's my question for you. Would you rather take on a tied tenancy with lower upfront cost but less long-term control, or save up for a free-of-tie or freehold pub with more independence but a much bigger entry price? Tell me which you'd choose and why in the comments.